Welcome, everybody. My name is David Wood and I chair London Futurists. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'll say a few quick words to provide context. In our meetings at London Futurists, we often draw attention to the profoundly good outcomes that forthcoming technologies could enable. For example, we sometimes talk about sustainable superabundance, or about super longevity, and about overcoming the negative aspects of the behavioral characteristics we have all inherited from evolution and from history. Our sets of cognitive biases, our flawed ad hoc rules of reasoning, our dysfunctional social relationships, our adversarial power dynamics, and our often destructive emotional instincts. All of these detrimental aspects of human nature could be solved or transcended, potentially within just a few decades, by wise application of radical new technologies. That's an example of the positive vision. But before reaching that better future, our journey could be derailed. Possibly an asteroid could strike the Earth from far distant space, similar to the one that wiped out the dinosaurs around 65 million years ago. A terrible new plague could sweep around the planet with transmissibility matching that of the fastest spreading COVID variants, but with a lethality much higher. The greenhouse gases which we have been collectively pumping into the atmosphere could trigger a disastrous phase change in our global climate system, resulting not in linear climate change, but in exponential climate change. And that's just the start of the negative possibilities. It turns out that we humans aren't very good at thinking about catastrophic or existential risk. Evolution didn't prioritize giving us the appropriate skills. We can all too easily be overcome by unhelpful panic or lethargy or depression. And then we allow ourselves to be distracted, potentially to fiddle as Rome burns, as the Emperor Nero is alleged to have done. That's where we futurists, we practitioners of foresight, need to raise our caliber. We can't let ourselves be misled or paralyzed by what could be called future shock or existential risk shock. And to help us on that count, I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Otto Barten, the director of the Existential Risk Observatory. Otto has a previous life as a sustainable energy engineer, a data scientist, and an entrepreneur. He says that when he realized that existential risks are even more important than climate, he started the Existential Risk Observatory. He has a BSc in theoretical physics from the University of Groningen and an MSc in Sustainable Energy Technology from Delft Institute of Technology. Otto, please help us all to see more clearly. Over to you.
Thanks very much, David. It's a really high bar to meet, so I'm sure I will not be able to meet that, but thanks anyway a lot for inviting me. And it's a particular privilege to be here at the London Futurists, because this is also exactly the place where I got into existential risk, and I was first told basically about existential risks by Anders Sandberg, who had a lecture here about 5 years ago, I think, and physically in London, where I attended more or less randomly and drawn perhaps more by the grand futures that he spoke about than by the existential risks. But in the end, it was the existential risks anyway that got me most interested, and I'll talk about that in more detail now. Let me share some slides with you. The Existential Risk Observatory, we are about reducing human extinction risks by informing the public debate, and I will dive into that more deeply in this presentation. So first, what are existential risks? The definition we follow Toby Ord from the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. In his definition, that existential risks are risks that threaten the destruction of humanity's long-term potential. So that is very much the potential that David has been talking about, the long-term future potential that we like to get to. And of course, there's a lot of, there's not necessarily agreement, I think, on what would be the best long-term potential. And of course, it's really hard to look ahead that far. But there are a couple of situations where we definitely don't want to end up. And I think human extinction is a particularly easy one to reach agreement on. That's something where we don't want to be. But unrecoverable collapse or dystopian lock-in, perhaps dependent on what your definition of dystopia is, particularly because it might be that some people's utopians are other people's dystopians and vice versa. But still, there are some situations where we could all agree that we don't want to end up there. And these are the existential risks. And we think that most of the danger and also perhaps most of the significance of the existential risk is in human extinction. So we're focusing mostly on human extinction and the difference between human extinction and existential risk. I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it's not too important for us. And we follow, apart from the definition of Toby Ord, we also follow his figures. And you see those in the graph to the right. So these are the existential risk sources. And the existential risks sources are defined over the coming 100 years. And then you see unaligned AI with a very high bar of about 10%. Toby Ord is actually giving these numbers at page about 400 in his book, The Precipice. It's a bit tucked away, and he's also not presenting it as a graph like this, but he's presenting it as a 1 in 10 chance or a roughly 1 in 30 chance or numbers like this. But we think this is very important, and despite, as a data scientist, I'm particularly aware that numbers are sometimes rough guesses, and you should not treat this as science. It's definitely not. There's no experiment that you can do to find out whether these are right, and these are very inaccurate guesstimates. But still, it does mean something if you say that the risk of one thing is 100 times bigger than the risk of another thing. They have to be really wrong to still prioritize this other thing, or there could be other reasons for this. But we think it's still very important to have good guesstimates of the existential risk magnitudes. And that's why we put this graph front and center at our website. So we see from this graph that unaligned AI is probably the biggest source of existential risk right now. Then at a second place, we have the pandemics. Then we have climate change, nuclear war, and total natural risk. These are very small and basically mentioned to show that these are not really the things to worry about if you want to talk about existential risk. Of course, there are very good reasons to worry about climate change in any case and to want to reduce the chance of really bad climate change in any case. And that's in fact what I've worked on as well, and I've done some climate activism before as well. So I'm definitely not climate denialist. Although there were some activists that actually got slightly angry when they saw this graph because they thought that climate change was cut off too poorly, and the people might deprioritize working on climate change if you show them a graph like this. I don't think it's really fair, but what it does show is that the chance that really everyone dies because of climate change, that it's a true human extinction event, that chance is particularly small. It's kind of the same for nuclear war. Actually, the chance that there is a nuclear war is relatively big for the next 100 years, perhaps, or at least in the order of a few percent, perhaps. But the chance that we all die because of a nuclear war, then it doesn't. Then one bomb definitely doesn't suffice. But you really have to have a very bad nuclear war and a bit of bad luck probably as well. That's why this chance is also small, and it doesn't mean it's not a big problem anymore. But it just means that the probability for existential risk is small. Total natural risk, even smaller, especially asteroid strikes and supervolcanoes. Actually, we have a really good probabilities for those because we are already around for 300,000 years, and we can see how often asteroid strikes and supervolcanoes occur. And also because of science, we have a relatively good understanding of those, so we can estimate with confidence that the chance of natural risk is it's really small and not really something to worry about in the next 100 years. And then other is a very interesting category. And we've actually grouped two categories together that Toby Ord is treating as two separate things. And one is other known existential risks. So this includes things like nanotechnology, for example, but also other mostly technological sources of existential risk that we know are there, but they don't seem to be too important compared to unaligned AI in pandemics, at least. And the second category is unknown unknowns. That's an interesting one, I think. And actually, we think that perhaps Toby Ortiz even underestimated this, but that's a big one for sure. The thought experiment is that what if you would have needed to estimate existential risks at the beginning of this century, or let's say the beginning of the 20th century, then you would not have included artificial intelligence probably, you would not have included biotechnology, you might not have included nuclear technology, but maybe you would have said something about magnetism or electricity or just focus on the natural risks. In other words, you would have been really far off and you would have missed actually the biggest sources of existential risk. And of course, our technological progress is accelerating and the technologies we find are ever more capable. So you would guess that for the next 100 years, we're going to invent more powerful technologies than we can currently imagine. And it could be that the existential risks from those technologies are also even higher than the ones that we have from our current ones, because they are more powerful. So logically, you might say that the unknown unknowns are actually even higher. The risks are even higher than from the other ones combined. So this is really could be quite an important one, but it's also a very abstract one because you really have no idea what to worry about. Doesn't mean that you can not do anything about it, but it is already existential risk is a fairly abstract topic I think to talk about, but unknown unknowns is even harder to communicate. So the summary existential risk in the next 100 years is estimated at 1 in 6 by Toby Ort. We think that's it's a very uncertain estimate, but it's more or less a reasonable estimate. I've heard things between 1 in 2 by Martin Rees, but also 1 in 100. This is roughly the extremes of these estimates. But we more or less go with Toby Ort and 1 in 6. We think it's reasonable. The very likely source is new technology in one way or another. And technology is man-made, so risk can be reduced in principle. It's not something that we can definitely not do anything about. It could be that we have good ways of dealing with it. There's a lot of uncertainty for sure, but it looks like we can reduce these existential risks. So now I'll talk a little bit more about unaligned AI because it's particularly large existential risk and also because we're spending a lot of time thinking and communicating about this one. Also, after talking a bit about the existential risks, I'll talk more about the Existential Risk Observatory and why we think public communication is a good idea, for example, and how we've set up this. But first about the existential risks, so unaligned AI. Unaligned AI is basically artificial intelligence with goals differing from most of ours. And so we want to go in a certain direction and the AI wants to go in another direction. And what people are particularly worrying about is, of course, artificial general intelligence. That means artificial intelligence, which is better not only at one task than us, such as AI is already now, better at chess or better at Go or better at driving cars, but AI that's better at all tasks. So we call this artificial general intelligence. And this could be the one that could be hard to control. So we're worrying about this one for existential risk. So how come the AI goals different from ours? Because we programmed it, or we created it in some way. So how could those goals become different? Well, there's a number of reasons and a number of ways this could occur. First, we could fail to formulate well what we want. In fact, it seems to be very difficult to formulate well what we want. So there's a reasonably big probability that we fail to formulate it properly. It's really hard, of course, to put, especially in mathematics, what we want. We don't know what we want. That's an open question in philosophy, has been for thousands of years, and it's quite unlikely that we find a way to put this into a nice mathematical formula that the AI can work with. That's a bit simplifying, but there's definitely a problem over there. Second possibility is that the AI tries to find our goals itself, but it fails. So for example, it looks at our data and tries to formulate from our data what we want, but it fails in doing so and it ends up pursuing another goal. Third one is that our goals change and we cannot change the AI, so we have actually managed to implement our goals properly, but after we've done so, of course the world will change quite a bit probably when we have strong AI, so it could be that we want one thing, but then after we have implemented artificial general intelligence, our goal is actually changing. We say, oh, wait, we didn't mean that, but we cannot change the AI anymore. Or fourth, a bad actor implemented the goal, for example, terrorist or rogue states. Of course, there are many bad actors that we can think of. That would be an aligned AI. Technologically, it would work fine, but it would still become an existential risk, or at least an unaligned AI. Fifth one is that the goals of a small elite were implemented, and they differ a lot. This is very easy to imagine for me that small elite is creating artificial general intelligence. You can see, of course, now what happens with Facebook. There's also a small elite running relatively powerful algorithms, and a lot of us don't like the outcome of this. And this problem could become a lot worse with artificial general intelligence because it's a lot more powerful and harder to steer. So, for example, we could imagine that someone wants to make money for my company, and this guy goes around doing this, but it will kill everyone who cannot contribute to this goal to make money for the company. Could be one outcome. Final one is to implement short-term goals. For example, the AI is trying to get, again, a lot of profit for the company, or some other short-term goal that even if it's democratic, then the AI might think that this is a good idea and this is what we all want. But it turns out that in the long run, and for example, climate, that took hundreds of years to develop. First, we thought it was a really good idea to develop steam engines, and it probably was, but then again, we had no idea at this point that the long-term effect would be climate change. Might still have developed steam engines, but in any case, we don't really know what the long-term effects of the technology that we implement now are. And the more powerful this technology is, the bigger the problem might be and harder it might be to correct. So there's many reasons why AI could not be aligned to most of us, at least not in the long term, and this could all become problematic. Now, this will only really become problematic when we have artificial general intelligence, and that means artificial intelligence that can carry out any task better than we can. So that means that AI would need to outsmart us. It's quite likely that AI will eventually outsmart us, we think, and a lot of people in AI safety and in existential risk think, because AI grows just amazingly fast. You can see this in the logarithmic plot on the right. That the amount of neurons in the largest neural network, which are perhaps some indication of intelligence, although perhaps not the best one, but still some indication. This grew by, that is 6, 7, 8, 9 orders of magnitude in about 15 years. So that's just enormous, and it already exceeds the amount of neurons in the human brain. It doesn't mean that AI is smarter than us at this point, because it's not, but it does give an indication that really a lot is changing in terms of the hardware that we have, and that AI might in fact outsmart us relatively soon, or at least somewhere in the next decade. So it's not too early to worry about this. It's different from the 60s. In the 60s, people were already forecasting that AI might outsmart us, but back then, of course, we didn't have the computation power anywhere close to the human brain, so a bit of skepticism was then reasonable, I think. But right now we do have this kind of computational power, so it's basically it does seem to be more likely that AI will eventually outsmart us, especially over the next 100 years, of course, which is the time span for the existential risk. Also, AI will likely not stop there, as we can see from this little chess graph that I've put on the right. This is not developing. It's not improving itself, of course. This computer, humans just keep improving it, but you can still see there's no reason that AI is stopping at the best human level. It's just continuing to get better. After beating Kasparov, the best chess computers went on to beat the best chess computers up until that point, and there's not really an end in sight necessarily. And this is, of course, narrow intelligence, but it could be an indication that for artificial general intelligence, Artificial, AI also doesn't need to stop at the human level, but it could become a lot smarter and thereby also hard to control. And then, of course, we have the positive feedback loop, also known as the singularity, which is a very important effect. We think that if you have artificial general intelligence, then it could improve either hardware or software, either with human aid or without human aid. But there are many ways in which AI could be used to improve itself. So it seems likely that once we have AGI, or perhaps already before that, that we will end up in something like a singularity. That means a fast increasing capability of this AI, ending up at what Nick Bostrom would call superintelligence. And that is that's a major concern for control, of course. So can we control something far smarter than us? That would be the superintelligence. Possibly not, since first AI safety scientists have tried to do this for about 2 decades, but they've failed so far. And second, there are also theoretical reasons. I think Jan Polsky talked about this in the previous talk. He wrote a few papers outlining some theoretical reasons why the control problem might not be solvable. I think on top of that, there's very interesting work about the evolutionary problem, where the argument is basically that even if you have multiple AIs and some AIs might be controlled, then perhaps the most aggressive and least controlled would win out, since they don't have this. They don't have to spend resources on being nice to us as well. So that's also a theoretical reason why even if you would solve the control problem for one AI, it might still be very hard to control it for all AIs. So we're not saying that it's definitely not possible. We should definitely try to control AI, but there are reasons to fear that this might not work out or might not work out in time. So that's why we are fairly confident that Toby Ord is right, and this is an existential problem. Then even if we avoid extinction, there are other reasons we might still want to look at AI. This is also one reason that we're putting this a little bit front and center at the Existential Risk Observatory. That is, for example, that human work is no longer important economically. Worker power decreases to 0. It also means that much bigger unemployment could lead to an unstable society. This is kind of the negative part of what David was talking about. Of course, there's also the positive part. It just means that the computer can do everything that we can. That does provide amazing opportunities, but it also leads to enormous risks. So focusing now on the risks, even beyond human extinction, even if we manage to avoid this, then we still have these issues. So, for example, much bigger unemployment might lead to an unstable society. You can also not really say that, okay, some jobs get perhaps replaced by AI, but other jobs will replace those jobs, because by definition, AGI is better than us at carrying out any task. So it's really hard to imagine any job that cannot be replaced in that situation. So it also means that much more earning power for whoever owns the AGI, which could be a tiny elite. So it could become a really unstable and very unequal situation potentially. And it's that also carries over to political power, much more political power to whoever owns the AGI. And perhaps we managed to implement this very democratically and very nicely. But we think it's at least reasonable to think about these issues before we implement technology. So this can be summarized a little bit by the small equation. Output used to be a function of work and capital, but with artificial general intelligence, output becomes a function of capital. Basically, if you have capital, you can rent cloud time, you can get output. So that has very deep economic and societal consequences that we should think about, even beyond the extinction risk. And this is just top of the iceberg, basically. I think it's such an enormous change in technology that human extinction risk is one thing, and this is another thing. But there's probably a host of different issues, both positive and negative, that we would want to think very deeply about before inventing this, before employing it as well. But that's going to be hard, but we're trying to give a small contribution to this. So that was a lot about AI. Of course, there's also non-AI existential risks. Pandemics is one significant one, just the same graph as I've showed before, based on Toby Ort on the right. So existential risk danger of pandemics seems to be mostly in the man-made pandemics and not so much in the natural pandemics. Natural pandemics such as COVID, but even something way worse as the plague in the Middle Ages, never wiped us out in the last 300,000 years. So the chance that it will do so in the next 100 years, even if we have perhaps more bioindustry or more risk increasing factors, more travel, but on the other end also more science. But the risk that this is really causing human extinction seems very small. So probably the biggest danger here is that biotech is getting cheaper and better. So making viruses could democratize. So basically, everyone could generate viruses, and also these viruses, with the help of biotechnology, could become a lot worse. If you want to generate a really bad virus, then you can probably do a lot worse than nature is doing randomly, and also a lot faster. So this is, I think, the biggest reasons that the existential risk of pandemics is mostly in the man-made ones. Perhaps on the positive side, you might say that warning shots are quite likely. If you generate a pandemic, it's quite easy probably to generate a COVID-like pandemic, which is also worrying, of course, but it's nowhere near an existential risk. So if you go about generating pandemics, then it's quite likely that you first end up generating a non-existential pandemic, and perhaps there will be a warning shot to make it harder to do this. So warning shots in pandemics, we estimate are fairly likely, and perhaps that's one of the reasons that Toby Ort is also not assigning an enormously high probability to existential risk because of biotechnological pandemics. But they're still dangerous, and of course they're also very dangerous for non-existential reasons. So they definitely, they do demand our attention. Nanotechnology is an interesting one. That in the 90s, this was actually seen as one of the biggest existential risks. Even nanotech was used as a kind of combination of nanotech and AI. People thought that if you have AI, then it's going to lead to nanotech, and if you have nanotech, then it's going to lead to AI. And back then, it seemed to appear that nanotech might be there first. So there was a lot of attention in the 90s about existential risk because of nanotech, much more than we hear now. I think that decreased because of lack of technological progress relative to AI. Of course, the technological progress in AI has really been amazing. Nanotech not at the same speed. So perhaps that's a reason that we don't hear as much now, but it used to be seen as an existential risk, and you don't hear that much about it now anymore. So perhaps it's under investigated. It's also something that we should look at. And then the unknowns, I already talked a little bit about that before. It does seem dangerous. It's underreported. It's really hard to talk about it because it's really hard to tell people something about something that we really don't have any information about. We don't even know what to talk about, really. So it's underreported even by us. But we do think that more attention to existential risk in general, and also if you look at this graph, you say, okay, what's this big bar on the right? We should do something with it as well. So we do think that that more attention to existential risk in general might also decrease the unknown unknowns. So our prioritization in this graph is mostly on AI for a few reasons. First, because it's the biggest one, of course, so that's an important reason. But also, we prefer to focus on one narrative. We want to reduce human extinction risk by public communication. So we would like to have a narrative that is as clean as possible, and it's nice to focus on something. So that's one reason we mostly focus on AI now. Also, we don't really focus on climate, nuclear, and natural existential risks, mostly because they're smaller, but also because they're less neglected. Everyone is already keenly aware that climate change is a big problem, that nuclear war is a threat. So it's not that necessary to put this in the public debate. Also, not really focusing that much on man-made pandemics. They're smaller as an existential risk, although still quite big. And as I said before, warning shots there are more likely. And the unknowns do seem really dangerous, actually, but are harder to communicate. and we make recommendations that might help for those as well. If we put existential risk in general on the agenda, then we hope that this will also have knock-on effects for the unknown unknowns. So one thing, it's a bit of a detail maybe, but could have significant consequences to talk about existential risk or about extinction risks. There was a paper written about democratization of existential risk recently. I could recommend it to anyone. Look, yes, and they recommend to separate the study of extinction ethics, that's also the ethical implications of extinction, and existential ethics, the ethical implications of different societal forms, from the analysis of human extinction and global catastrophe. So you might say, okay, existential risk is a little bit of a mess up between, on one end you have ethical considerations, and on another end you have the really a research topic, how could we go extinct? And they are saying perhaps it's better to separate those and to research separately what are the biggest extinction risks, and apart from that to the ethical research somewhere else basically. So our reason to choose existential risk is fairly pragmatic, that at this moment there's most research available into existential risk, but we're just we're mostly worried about extinction. And human extinction is of course also easier to understand for most people. You don't really have to go in this definition so much. So yeah, if there would be academical research about human extinction from the same quality that Toby Orr's book, for example, is, then we might use that as well. We're kind of agnostic here. We don't really have a strong opinion whether it should be existential risk or extinction risk. Existential Risk Observatory. I will now talk a little bit more about why we think that the observatory is needed, and also how we have managed to build this up and where we want to go in the future. So we think that the global priorities at this point are not set right. And you can see that very clearly, I think, in the graph on the right. We're not saying that climate change is unimportant or is a detail or it shouldn't be solved. We think it's a very important problem, and it's nice that it receives so much attention now and so much investment. But we think existential risks are an arguably bigger problem. And the amount of investment that existential risk reduction is receiving now, and also the amount of talent or the amount of people working on it, perhaps there's even bigger discrepancy. It really doesn't add up. So we see that funding for existential risk is about 4 orders of magnitude smaller than the funding for climate. Well, the importance of existential risk is likely higher, and for talent working on this, you could make a similar graph. And we think that higher existential risk prioritization would actually decrease risk. So basically, if more people were worried about this and were taking action, we think that would have a positive effect on reducing existential risk. I think that's kind of a no-brainer, but not everyone agrees. So perhaps we can kind of discussion about it a bit later. And our method for that is raising awareness. We think that the most important reason why the graph on the right is as it is because the climate change awareness is almost universally there. Almost everyone knows about this problem. Some people might deny it or perhaps choose to deny it even, but the knowledge is definitely there. The information is there. And that's just not really true for existential risks. A lot of very important issues there. For example, the fact that AGI might improve AGI, or the difference between AGI and AI, or even that there are a lot of academics, not only fiction movies, but also a lot of academics who think that AI is an existential risk, and that new technology has a bigger chance of making humans go extinct than natural causes. That's not; these things are not universal knowledge, among others. So we think that if they were, if we would be able to raise awareness, then this graph on the right would probably also change, and we would be able to set our global priorities better, and in the end, decrease human extinction risk. So some of the advantages we see in raising awareness: we think raising awareness leads to an increase of talent available, funding available, number of institutes working on the topic. Diversity, leading to a more robust response. That's also one of the points that the paper I talked about before was was making, that if we manage to democratize this topic somewhat, to increase diversity, then it should also lead to a more robust response, and that's better risk management, we think. And fifth point, to raising awareness could also lead to an increase of priority, even among actors already working on it. It still seems somewhat far out, even if you're working at an established existential risk institute right now. You still have to talk to a lot of other people that might not really see the existential threat, and that might also decrease the priority that you're attaching to your own work and to these institutes. And finally, we think there's arguably also a fairness reason to raise awareness that could be summarized as the right to know, perhaps. I'm often thinking if nobody would have told me in the 90s about climate change because they thought you don't really need to know and you cannot really change it anyway, then I would have been kind of angry with them, and I don't think it would have been fair. So I think with existential risk, we should also think about this. That is it fair to not tell people if they're actually at the risk of becoming extinct? So we think that raising awareness is also self-reinforcing. So we start by informing the debate with scientific existential risk insights. So there is existential risk information from academia, and we bring this information basically to the public. So informing the debate should then lead to more existential risk awareness. And probably this public will want to do something about this at some point, and thereby one of the actions that they might take, and we're also recommending this, is to fund more research. And then this funding research will lead to more research on the topic, and then again to more information. So this could be a self-reinforcing loop. We think this positive feedback loop leads to growth of existential risk awareness, of research capacity, and finally also of existential risk reduction capacity. We've proven now as what we are proving as an organization is that a small organization can also raise awareness effectively. We've now published 3 articles in national Dutch media in 4 months of doing this, the last 4 months of 2021. The reach was about 1.5 million readers. According to research, about 9% changed their opinion. According to research, about 9% changed their opinion when reading an op-ed. So that means that we have raised awareness for about 135,000 people, while we are self-funded and only have about 3 FTE. So apparently, it is possible for a small organization to raise awareness. So how to do this? How to start a small communication organization or an existential risk observatory? This is a very practical guideline. I can imagine, and I know that there are a lot of people in the existential risk community who would really like to work on this and are very motivated, but they're not AI academics, or they don't really have the academical background to work in one of the established institutes. But I think this is something that perhaps not anyone can do, but that a lot of people could do in different countries as well. In the Netherlands, this was a fairly neglected topic. We've counted about 7 articles in mainstream media about existential risk before we came in. So it's relatively doable in such a neglected context to still have a sizable impact with your organization. So very practically, how to do this. We've started by building a visually appealing website. Visually appealing is often underestimated. I did a startup before, and it's really important that you have a nice website, so don't forget to ask a designer for help. Find a board, of course, and set up your institute legally. Find existential risk interested academics and approach them for cooperation. In the Netherlands, we were lucky enough to have the University of Groningen and the University of Utrecht as well, where there was already some work carried out on existential risk. I didn't really know those people, but I just basically Googled their website with Toby Ord, for example, or Nick Bostrom, or you can imagine some of the search terms. And then it's relatively doable to find a few academics that are already fairly into this narrative of existential risk and approach them to work together. And they are generally quite willing to do so. Then hire a freelance PR person. It does cost a bit of budget, but it's definitely worth it. In our case, and yeah, I think in any case, this should basically be an ex-journalist with a network, an existing network. And then you can write some op-eds together with both of the above. We tried some other things before as well. We did organize an existential risk conference. It was also very interesting. It was the first existential risk conference in Europe, to our knowledge, and I think the second even globally. And also, if you Google existential risk conference, we're on the first few items. So that was already impactful, perhaps for that reason. But the reason that we wanted to do it is to start the societal debate. And that didn't really happen. It was relatively easy to get people in there that already cared about existential risk, but it was not so easy to start a societal debate and to get new people interested by organizing this conference. So we're not really planning to do that again this year. And for communication, there's also a few other things that we tried or that we considered than writing op-eds. But writing op-eds is fairly nice because you can craft your own message. That's really good. So you don't have to be simplistic, or you don't have to tell something that, or you don't. It's also a risk to get misquoted by a journalist, or maybe say something that you regret, or that ends up in the article. And I think that has been one of the reasons that not all the existential risk institutes are really into getting into the media. But when you write an op-ed, you can avoid those. And it also gives enough space to make your point properly, as opposed to social, for example, where you have to make an existential risk point in 2 lines of text. That's really hard. So we think writing op-eds is a good way to, and it's also relatively easy actually to do an op-ed together with a professor and with a PR person. Then there's a fair chance that you can get it into the leading publication, and thereby raise existential risk awareness, which is the final goal. And then the 6 points, so that is to publish in the mainstream media. And our result by doing this took us about roughly half a year, I would say, with a few FTE. And our result was that we increased existential risk societal debate in the Netherlands as measured by the number of articles in print media. It's also a way that more established organizations measure how much societal debate is there about a certain issue. And we've managed to increase this metric by 25%. So for a starting organization, I think it's really nice that you can do this, that you can really make an impact here. And this is really our proof of concept phase. So of course, the bigger ambition is to raise awareness globally and to raise awareness for a much bigger number of people, and also to raise awareness more structurally or more impactful. I guess if someone is reading an existential risk op-ed, they might. So according to research, 9% is changing their opinion, but we didn't actually check how well this is, how true this also is for existential risk. So it's not. I think op-eds are a good method to start this, but it's not necessarily the final way of communication. So what we've shown here is that we can do this, that we can really make an impact in a country by writing these op-eds. But finally, of course, what you want is just to make the decision, okay, we should start communicating this issue to everyone, and how can we do this most effectively? And then writing op-eds was a good concept for us, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily the best way. But we do believe this shows that this can be done. It can be done by many people, and we think that people should do this because we do believe it reduces existential risk in the end. So raising awareness, we think it's not only possible, but it's also efficient. After our publications, we had fruitful meetings with the president of the Parliamentary Committee for Digitization in the Netherlands, the spokesperson for the Secretary of State of Digitization. And we think these meetings were, they were nice, but they didn't lead to policy change yet necessarily, and that's to be expected in the beginning. But we think if we carry on doing this, we can meaningfully influence policy in the future. So it's really a really nice way to also influence policy in the future to decrease existential risk. And one thing you could do in this policy right now, the Dutch government is investing 290 million euros per year in AI, zero in AI safety, because they don't even know there's a problem there. So if we assume that 10% can be diverted towards AI safety because of our efforts, then that would mean that around 300 AI safety researchers could be hired in the Netherlands alone. And that's about 100 times more than the 3 FTE. So we think if we work on this for a few years, they could actually hire AI safety researchers, whereby you would have a 100 times higher return on your investments than if you invest into research directly. So we think raising awareness is an efficient thing to do. Of course, there's a lot of other reasons as well why you would want to raise awareness. These 5 points that I made before, this is only one of them, but it already shows that it seems important. Strangely, still communication does seem to be neglected. It's not true that there has not been any communication about existential risk or about human extinction. Of course, the book of Nick Bostrom was discussed a lot. Toby Ord also had interviews in the New York Times and in big established newspapers, mostly in the Anglo-Saxon world, but still. But there's no institute specifically focusing on this, and we think that's funny if you see how effective it could be and what the advantages are. So existing organizations on existential risk, these are not all of them, but just some of the more prominent ones. But they are generally either a research institute. There's lots of research institutes doing very good work, but not really focusing on communication. And movements. So movements, for example, effective altruism is very much a movement, I think, and you could also say that that Les Wrong or the rationalist movement is definitely also important in this space. But there's no other organization directed at increasing awareness today. It does happen, but it happens on an ad hoc basis. And we argue that it should happen structurally, so that you should have some organization trying to raise awareness as much as possible. So our 2022 targets, we want to get 3 more publications published in the Netherlands. We also want to have 3 publications in the US, because we want to show that you can also do this internationally, and that it's not just right now we are a relatively important organization, perhaps in the Netherlands, in the field of existential risk, but this is of course a niche location for the whole problem. But the ambition to say, okay, we should start communicating structurally, and this is a global idea. So we think we also want to be active in the global debate. And make the same, basically make the same point there, that that publication to a general audience is also important there. And the third target is to raise funding for further growth. Right now we have demonstrated that we can do this, but we've not scaled up yet, and we will need funding to do that. What's also interesting in scaling up is that there's no obvious upscaling limits. Some things are really hard to scale up. We think communication is quite easy actually to scale up. It requires a lot of, it's also a bit of a weakness perhaps, that it requires a lot of manual labor. You need to talk to journalists, you need to call people, you need to talk to politicians, you need to, it is a manual process. But it also means that there's no obvious upscaling limits until we have raised awareness globally sufficiently, but it's very far away. So a bit more into that, our long-term communication ideas. We think existential risk communication to a general audience is net positive. We also think it's efficient. So we think that the existential risk community should actively and structurally start raising awareness. And of course, we want to be a part of this, but we don't aim to monopolize it, and we don't think it would be efficient to have only one institute for this. But we emphasize a lot of existential risk observatories in different cultural contexts, in different countries, that are basically competing for the most efficient existential risk awareness raising, and then competing for funding probably. So we think that, there should be more organizations like this, and that should raise awareness effectively. The team of our current organization, I'm the chairman and the founder. Then in the board we have Marco van der Waal, who's working at who's the secretary of the board and is working at a publishing house in Amsterdam. Joep Soeren, who's an entrepreneur and the treasurer of the organization. And then the team, we have Mirte Hilkens as a freelance help. She's ex-parliamentarian, ex-journalist, and our campaign strategist. Before she had really great, she had really great media campaigns before. So we hope that she can do something similar for existential risk as well. We have Ruben Dieleband from Effective Altruism in the Netherlands. He's helping with press outreach, and Stan Bogert, who's working as a civil servant and is helping out in lobbying. And we have advice and endorsement from Andreas Schmid from Groningen University, Simon Friedrich. They've also co-authored some of our articles. And Jan Bergstra, he's a professor emeritus and chair of the computer science section of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Yeah, with that, I would want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and later perhaps even to the pub talk as well.
Thanks so much, Otto. That's a really good framework when you set out things nice and clearly. Why you're worried about these topics and what you propose that your organization can focus on in a unique way that's different from what other people are trying to do. And also very usefully, you have shown what you have already accomplished. Now, there are a number of questions in the Q&A window. I'm sure more will arrive. I'm going to encourage the audience to put questions, short questions ideally, in the Q&A window, and also vote for each other's questions, so that will help me to prioritize. But I'd like to start with a question that Tony Zarneski asks. If we want to communicate and get our message across, do we need to put dates into the message? Do we need to say, like the climate change campaigners have said, hey, we've only got a certain number of years late. The climate could be beyond our measures to tame it unless we act by 2030, say. So do you think it would help if you could state in a clear and credible way that AI will possibly move beyond human ability to control it by 2030 or a similar date? Or are you content to leave dates out of your communications?
I think it would help if we could communicate dates, but I'm not sure that we can, because at least at this moment I'm not aware of any academic research. Basically, we're only communicating academic research. We don't really communicate anything that's not sourceable, because it makes our story weaker. And at this moment, I'm not aware of any academic research, and I also don't think that this can be done, that says, okay, we will have AGI by 2030, for example, and we need to prepare before that date. So since we don't have that information, I also don't think it's possible to communicate it. If you kind of make it up, then I think it makes the story weaker rather than stronger, but that's my estimate. I know, for example, that some people are throwing around timelines. For example, Elon Musk, I think he said 2 years ago that he thought we were looking at a 5-year timeline. It could help. I mean, it could help to underline the urgency. But personally, I don't think I would do it if you cannot source it. So I would say it would be nice if we could, but I don't think we can, and I don't think we will be able to do that either.
I have to agree that the people who have looked at predictions have not found a consensus emerging. There are many different ways to measure how AI could be improving, what might be the bottlenecks, what might be the breakthroughs and the causes of acceleration, and there is no consensus there. So I don't think there can be any completely credible forecast, but you've already embraced the idea of probabilities. You have said, well, within the next 100 years, there's a certain percentage chance of these extinction phenomenon. So couldn't you also say, well, within the next 20 years, there might be a range of probabilities, a smaller range, of course, but things that were still high enough, most likely, to raise more awareness?
Yeah, so for us, Basically, we put the bar at is there academic work supporting this? So of course now we're using Toby Ort a lot, not necessarily because we think his estimates are better than anyone else's, but also because he's a clear and credible academic, and he's delivered a great book on the topic, and it does make the communication a lot stronger. So if someone else would write a book about the coming 30 years, or a great paper that we can cite with estimates that are not completely out of thin air, but that do seem realistic, then we would be happy to communicate that as well. And it would help, of course, because right now we're communicating in the next 100 years. It might look a little bit, not too important to act upon right now. Well, in fact, it seems that nobody really knows when AGI will be there, or when those other technologies will be there. So it could actually also happen tomorrow. So we do think it's an urgent problem. And we would also like to give a more urgent message, because we think that's probably good. But yeah, you need to have some existing academic research to cite, and if that's there, then it would help, I think.
I think Toby Ort's argument for this figure of 1 in 10, helpfully, he breaks it down in his book. He says, well, there's probably a 1 in 2 chance, a 50% chance that AI will reach the levels of AGI sometime in this century. And in that case, there's probably a 20% chance that it will go off in directions which are utterly detrimental to humanity. So he's already saying there's a 50% chance we won't get to AGI within 100 years. And if we do have it, there's an 80% chance that we'll be able to control it. And both these seem a bit too optimistic for me. I think it's much more likely we will get to AGI. And as you explained yourself, there are many reasons to worry about any attempts to control or rely on AI. So as for myself, I think that estimate is by Toby is low, but I accept what you're doing. You have to ground your communications in things that will stand up to criticism. And if you can ground them in academic research, then that will put you in a more secure situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I basically agree, and I also think it's helpful to break down these figures, and it would be helpful to break it down in even more detail. What would also be really helpful, I think, if there would be more sources. Right now, I think there's 2 quantifications, or maybe 3, about existential risk, and there's not really anything about human extinction risks from people outside of this existential risk framework. And I think that's extremely weird and concerning, and should be corrected as soon as possible. I would expect it for a topic as let's just use the climate comparison again. If there would be only one modeler for climate change, and they would say, well, it's probably 2 degrees. That's an extremely bad situation. Of course, you want to have dozens of scientists working on it, and be able to compare their work and get error margins. So even though this is necessarily a fairly speculative topic, I still think it would be great if there would be a lot more research, and we could compare things to each other, and perhaps then you would choose to use the figures for the next 30 years and not for the next 100 years, because it works better for communication, or because it's more relevant for policy. But currently there's just not so much around, so we're using whatever is available, basically.
Let me ask a question from Alan Crowley, who observes that there didn't seem to be a matrix in your presentation, a matrix in which you look not just at probabilities along one axis, but the scale of the impact on the other axis. And it was all about existential risks, and that's the only thing that mattered. Whereas I think many people will say, you're right, if there was a nuclear war, it probably wouldn't extinguish everybody. There might be a few 100,000 people in some remote part of the world who could continue. But still, we would say that would be utterly terrible, and we must do all that we can to stop it. And in any case, you already accepted that some risks that wouldn't extinguish humanity deserve a lot of attention. All your analysis about AI destroying jobs and causing people to go into psychological trauma and so on. So why don't you have that matrix of a scale along one and probability along another index?
It's a good question, and it's basically so it's not because I don't think that the rest is important. That's good to emphasize. I think Toby Ord did receive this criticism from some people who said it's kind of an attempt to make climate change look smaller or something like this. I don't think that's fair either. I don't think that that he thinks that the rest is unimportant, and we don't think so either. But we have to focus on something. It's really a matter of resources and time, and also neglectedness. We think that if you also focus on non-existential risks, or you're also including non-existential risk in the picture, then of course an enormous world of risks is opening up, because there's lots of non-existential risk. That you have to be expert enough in all these things to communicate about this. It would really obscure the message as well. So yeah, we are. It's basically the reason that we're not doing this is just time and resources. It's not that we think it's not important. Other people should do it for sure.
Somebody might say that you've named your organization the Existential Risks Observatory, but you're not actually observing, you're communicating. You're not actually looking out for signs that these risks are getting worse, the warning shots or the canary signals. So wouldn't it be more accurate, instead of Existential Risk Observatory, you are actually the communications about a unaligned AGI?
Yeah, that would not be inaccurate. Of course, it's a bit of a general matter with the existential risk community, that it's closely aligned with the AI safety community. A lot of people worrying about existential risk are actually worrying more about artificial intelligence than about any of those other risks. And I think, well, of course, looking at the graph of Toby Ord, he's clearly also on this side. And if you accept these probabilities, then it makes sense to worry most about the highest probability. So then the topics kind of get intertwined. And that happens for us as well, but it's not set in stone. So let's say that AI safety would make enormous progress, or that AGI would really get stuck, and the AI existential risk would decrease from 10% to 1%. Then we would be happy to focus on other things that look more dangerous then. So we do have the ambition to be kind of a map for people to look at. Okay, if we worry about human extinction, what should we worry about most, and which research should we read, and what should be, maybe also what should we try to do to stop it, although that's a really difficult topic.
The question that's currently got the most votes is by Steve Buss, and he raises an objection that many people might have in mind, which is that we don't need to worry about AGI, because there are actually some scientists, the leading neuroscientist in the UK, Anil Seth, who says that human consciousness is so mysterious and we are nowhere close to understanding it, and we are nowhere near to having human consciousness or something similar inside the AI systems we create. So we're a long way away from having any AGI. Does that argument impress you or interest you at all?
I would say that there's a couple of elements in this argument, but one that I would like to focus on is that we have to understand something first in order to make it. As an engineer, I never really understood what we were doing, and I think many engineers will recognize this. And in fundamental science, it's even worse. I think a lot of the progress that we have made in technology is really trial and error. And so we don't really understand what we're doing, but we kind of have an idea about the direction in which to research, and we just try a lot of things, and we fail all the time, and then sometimes it works, and then we say, okay, apparently it worked like this, and we still want to really know how it works until we have built it, and sometimes even after building it, we still don't understand how it works. So I think that perhaps that's also the reason that I'm relatively worried about this, as indeed some people are not, because I can easily see us inventing something else while not understanding how it works. So indeed, I agree that we don't understand a lot of consciousness. We don't really understand how our own brains work in general. But I'm not convinced that this is so another element is that I'm not necessarily convinced that consciousness is needed for artificial general intelligence. It could be needed, but it could also not be needed. I'm also not really convinced that that consciousness could not arise. Actually, you might say that, okay, if you build the neural network big enough, then perhaps consciousness will rise naturally even without understanding it. But these are all matters that and perhaps the final argument is just the expert argument that indeed some experts think that this is needed before arriving at artificial general intelligence, but there are also AI experts, and I think all the AI safety and existential risk experts agree on this, that there is a danger. So I think even if you don't understand anything about the topic yourself, and I'm not really understanding that much myself, then you should just look at the experts. And I think if you have a group of 100 experts and 3 say, okay, we probably go extinct, and the other 97 say there's nothing to worry about, then it's a risk and we should worry about it.
I have to say the book by Anil Seth recently, I think it's Being You. It is a great book. I like it a lot. He is critical of some of the understandings of forthcoming robots and AIs will be conscious. He thinks, no, that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, he is open to the possibility in due course that there will be silicon creatures that do have a kind of consciousness. But you're quite right too, Otto, I think, and Toby Ord and others would say this, the dangers from artificial intelligence do not require it to be conscious. If we had a cruise missile chasing us and it's targeting us as individuals, we won't relax when we think, hey, it's not really conscious. The fact that it's got a goal and the goal is detrimental to us is what we should worry about. So I think that is a good answer. I want to ask a question from Terry Raby, who raises a broader point. And this is in line with some of the comments in the end of Toby Ord's book. He says, well, there are existential risks, but there are other things which are kind of risk factors. They make all the other risks worse. And there are other things that will make our ability to manage risks easier. So more education means we're more able to manage risks. The growth of irrationality means that all risks, in a sense, become worse. So Terry is asking about the precautionary principle. So he's worried that ideological reasons stop us developing technology because there is a fear that something might go wrong. So there's a fear of genetically modified food, therefore we don't develop that. There is fear of various sorts of nuclear energy, so we don't develop that. So what's your view on that precautionary principle? Should we be shying away from anything that could have risks and therefore limit our ability to develop the good solutions as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We're actually fairly positive about the precautionary principle, but it's questionable whether it's doable. That's the issue. And I think perhaps among the people interested in existential risk, I think at least half of them would like the technology to delay, actually, to give us more time to prepare for it, because a lot of people are just don't think that we can prepare accurately in time. So then it would actually be good to apply the precautionary principle and to delay this technology until we are certain that we're safe and then develop it. The issue is how to do this, how to delay the technology effectively. That seems pretty hard, actually. For example, AI, you might regulate the research, or you might regulate the software development in some way. But perhaps then you get other actors that are even more risk averse and that are developing it in any way outside of your jurisdiction or later. Or perhaps you manage to stop software development, but then hardware development is still progressing. And then in 10 years later, basically anyone can make artificial general intelligence in their garage because it's not complicated at all anymore with the hardware that you have then. So it's unclear what kind of regulation would actually effectively delay the development of AI. So I would say if you could actually effectively implement the precautionary principle, then we would be more or less positive about this. If the technology is existentially risk dangerous, of course you shouldn't do this for all technologies. You should weigh the positive and the negative sides. And the negative sides includes existential risk for some technologies. Of course, there are also large positive sides, especially for AI, but also for the other technologies. So we think that if you could do this, then you should weigh per technology if the positive sides outweigh the negative sides and then carry on, or if the negative sides outweigh the positive sides, then perhaps pause a little until you've solved more of the safety issues. So if you can, it would be nice to apply the precautionary principle, but practically it's really hard. That's basically the summary.
Some critics will say that the precautionary principle is self-defeating because it says don't do anything if it might be dangerous. Well, doing nothing might be dangerous. Unless we take actions, we won't develop the solutions, the technologies to implement AI safety, the technologies to identify dangerous pathogens and solve them. So doing nothing is not to be recommended. So we have to weigh up the risks one way or the other.
Yeah, that's one idea. I think if we manage to do nothing at all, then you would say, okay, existentially we're okay because the natural risks are not that high. We have a very long time until the sun is exploding or whatever. So if we could actually do this, then we might be more safe. But it's definitely not an easy solution because, of course, David, you're also right that if you postpone useful technologies that could actually reduce existential risks, then it would make it less safe. So it's not so straightforward how to make it safer or less safe. But in general, we are kind of in favor of the precautionary principle, but we just think it's hard in practice.
The top ranked question is now by Ted Howard, who's sort of skeptical about the probability approach that you're taking. He says, well, in the long run, all of these risks are likely to be dangerous. In due course, there will be an asteroid. In due course, there will be a supervolcano. Shouldn't we therefore be ensuring that people are addressing all of them rather than naively focusing on just one or two that we somehow convince ourselves are the highest probability?
Yeah, in the end, I think it makes sense that in the end we do have to solve all of them. But in the end, could be a really long term, and we definitely don't have the resources right now to focus on all of them. So I think this probability graph could also be translated to a funding graph. The biggest probability get the most funding or the most attention to solve the quickest. I think that will be the best approach to in the end reduce existential risk. And of course, all of them should be solved, or at least it would be very nice if they all get solved. But if you focus now on the ones with the least probability, then it's not effective risk reduction. So we do think the probability really makes sense.
And even something like asteroid strikes, I think we have got plans afoot. We have the argument that there are something like 1 in 2,000 chance that it's going to hit the Earth in the next century, just by looking at historical data. And in any case, we are tracking most of the asteroids that have a chance of hitting the Earth. Now, we can't track all the small ones, but if they do hit the Earth, the likelihood is it'll be a disaster, but not a catastrophic disaster or an existential disaster. But I think that's where the community of risk observers comes in. We have to constantly kick each other's tires. We have to ask, are we really thinking about this? Have we thought through all the possibilities? And I'm told that maybe we think we are confident we know where all the asteroids are, but comets, which are a different kind of astronomical species, can come from further out of space much more quickly. And so we aren't yet fully convinced that we know where all the possible comets are that could strike us within the next few decades.
I've also heard the interesting argument that it might not actually be good to develop a way to adjust the course of those comets, because it could also be used as a weapon, and perhaps the risk that someone is using it as a weapon is actually bigger than the risk that you're solving, that it hits the Earth naturally. So it's not that clear that it's actually good to develop this capability, but it's a bit of a sidetrack.
Well, I think it's a good sidetrack. We have to have these discussions. We may think we are developing something that's going to have a good outcome, but when we develop it, we say, oops. Arguably, there is a view that what caused the COVID outbreak is legitimate, well-intentioned research into what might happen if various viruses were changed. Would we be able to cope with them? So there's gain of function research, allegedly. Well, it is being done in some parts of the world. And if it was done, what are the risks? Well, the risks are that there might be leaks of it. And that is one of the hypotheses for what has caused COVID. It's by no means proven, but it's not necessarily the leading hypothesis, but it is there too. So we need to have these honest, objective, searching discussions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's also one of the reasons that you should keep an eye on this probability, that if you're solving something with a relatively small probability and actually your dangerous itself seems, or your research itself seems dangerous, then it might be a reason that you should focus on that. That's one more reason I think why we should have those probabilities in mind.
Question from Didier Cornell, who is he declares himself in global agreement with what you said, and he's asking, well, how can we accelerate raising awareness? So he wants to know, what's your relationship with the other main organizations? You had a slide of these other organizations. Are you working with them? And what's your roadmap for closer cooperation with them?
Yeah, good question. And thanks for being in broad agreement. That's always nice. Yes, we're definitely in contact with them. We are also working together with Future of Life Institute. They have someone doing a lot of the policy lobbying in Europe, and he's a Dutchman as well. So we've co-authored some of those articles, and we're working together in various ways. We are also, we've had interest from people from CSER to also co-author articles with us. So we're definitely open for cooperation. And as said, we think that everyone should be doing this, and everyone should declare. I think it's fairly important that people declare openly that yes, public communication is a good idea. And if we are not doing it, then it's just because we don't have the resources for it. Okay, that's fair enough. Some people should focus on doing research, others should focus on communication. Or perhaps we think it's not efficient enough and our research is more efficient, and okay, that's also fair enough. Then it depends on the funding situation. But we do think it's important that people are more outspoken that communication is a good idea, and that we should try to look at ways to do this efficiently. And we're open for cooperation, and we have also cooperated so far with those institutes. The more established institutes have also done a lot of communication themselves, but it's a bit more in a haphazard way and not structurally. But we think, obviously, especially from effective altruism, there's a lot of funding, and from some other sources as well. And it would really make sense to set up a communication organization, or a way to communicate these risks together, and to just see what the most effective way of doing this is. Perhaps that's us, perhaps that's other people. That's all fine. But we're open to cooperate with those people, and we should just find a way to do this most effectively together.
Are you offering particular solutions to some of these risks? So the question here is by Robert Whitfield, who compliments you on a great presentation. He says he was surprised there was no reference to the human compatible beneficial AI concept that's been advocated by Stuart Russell from Berkeley. And he thinks that's a great possible promising idea that could address the control problem. So are you in the business of exploring potential solutions, or are you just in the business of highlighting risks and drawing attention to them?
It's a good question, and to be honest, we're still searching sometimes whether we should do this or not. It's very important, of course, as well. If we write this article and then we can also use it to propose solutions, and people will actually do this or fund this or make steps in making sure that they get to reality, then it's important. On the other hand, if we propose the wrong solutions, then we could be doing damage. So it's kind of difficult. We do very broadly say that, okay, these existential risks are caused by new technologies. So very broadly, you might look at ways to delay these technologies or make them safer. But basically, these are the two main solutions that we see. Indeed, develop safe AI. Stuart Russell's approach is one. There's a few others. We think all of those are very promising, and they should definitely be helped and be funded wherever possible. We don't think that they really need funding from the people that we are targeting with our articles, especially not in the Netherlands, because they are already quite well funded. But if people have better ideas to tackle AI safety, Stuart Russell's is one, but there's a few others that are also worth investigating. Then we definitely support those. We don't go to the level of detail to say that this is the better technological approach than that one. We don't really have opinions on to that level of detail.
Question from PNJ, who's asking about your knowledge of whether there's academic and publications that look into not just the risks of human extinction, but the risks of damage to human well-being or risks to damage of civilizational coherence. So are you aware of that kind of publications that could strengthen your argument for why AI or any of the other risks might be very damaging?
Yeah, no. Short answer is no, I guess. But perhaps the longer answer is that it's a bit similar to a question before. Like, should we also talk about non-existential risks? I think focus is important for a small organization as ours, and that's the reason that we focus on existential risks. That's also the reason that we're not really focusing that much on literature of global catastrophic risks, even though we think, of course, they're very bad as well, and other people should definitely be doing this. But we are mostly focusing on existential risks. For AI, that's also an interesting case that there's not too much in between existential and we're all fine. Of course, it could go wrong or it could go well, and it doesn't appear that there's that much in between. So for AI, it also makes sense to focus on existential risks, I think, because there is a lot of existential risk. But for other issues like climate change, nuclear war, pandemics, that's clearly a different picture, and there's enormous scope in between those extremes. And we think it's very important that people look into it, but we don't really have the capacity to do so.
That's a fair answer, and I suspect you'll have a similar answer to the next two questions that I'm going to lump together, because we are coming to the end of the formal part of this event. There's a question by Alan Crowley, basically saying, what about complexity science? You mentioned that a lot of the risks get worse by interactions between them. Are you modeling complexity science as a way to understand risks and escalating factors? And before you get a chance to answer that, I'm trying to squeeze in a comment by Ted Howard, who raises, what about a global strategy for collaboration? Unless we get the various academics, politicians, business leaders, humanitarians around the world collaborating more, we're very unlikely to cope with these risks. So why aren't you prioritizing this coordination of strategy rather than just pointing to the individual risks? So as I said, I think you've got good answers ready for both of these, but I'll lob the questions there in any case.
Yeah, so first, are we modeling these risks ourselves? No, definitely not, because it's research, and we're not really in the business of doing research, because other people are simply much better in this than we are. We thought that communication is the relatively neglected part. Research is also neglected. There's just a few hundred people, maybe rough estimate, working on this. But it's way too little. We think it should be orders of magnitude more, but it's still less neglected, and there are institutes doing a lot better work on this than we do, and they are also looking at risk factors for sure. So I think that's already done, and if the conclusion of that is that risk factors are the things that we should really worry about, and not so much the individual risk, then we will do it. We will communicate in that way as well, and we will use their research outcomes, but we will not do the modeling ourselves. Second question. if the communication and coordination was the most important to focus on. I don't have the issue that, or I don't have the impression that the communication and the coordination between the scientists working on existential risk or AI safety is particularly bad. I think that's they're working quite well together. Yeah, of course, there are always larger communication and coordination issues, but these are also quite hard to solve. I wouldn't have a clue how to solve those. Well, communication is also relatively, well, it's also not the easiest, but we could demonstrate to have a real measurable impact there. So that's also the reason that we're focusing on that now.
There's a lot more to be said about these points. There are still a number of very interesting questions in the Q&A and in the chat. We'll come to some of them in a moment once we transition into a more informal mode of this meeting after a short break. What I'm going to do first, if you don't mind, is I'm going to briefly run through what's happening next in the world of London Futurists, but also in the broader world. Today we've had this really stimulating talk by Otto about his work. There are other things happening in the world of existential risk, as he mentioned. So what's going to happen in about a month's time from one of the groups that he mentioned, the Centre for the Study of Existential Risks in Cambridge, are doing a 3-day conference with a broader viewpoint, not just existential risks, but also catastrophic risks. The first day looking at future risks of all sorts. The second day looking at actual catastrophes that have happened in the past and what we can learn from them. And the third day bringing the question back to global solutions. How can we put monitoring in place? How can we cooperate on a global scale? So I'm really looking forward to that conference, and I'll just list some of the talks that will be there. These are by no means all of them. Martin Rees, the eminent scientist and cosmologist, will be kicking it off. Luke Kemp, who I noticed, Otto, you mentioned one of his articles, one of his reports in your presentation. Looking further down that list, I really like the work of Brian Walsh, who had an excellent book also on the end of the world, which came out more or less the same time as Toby Ord's book, less philosophical, but in some ways more vivid and gripping. So he's going to talk about how do we raise awareness to long-term risks in a world that is obsessed by short-term issues in media. There's Sean O'Hegarty, who I've known since attending a conference on catastrophic risks in Oxford in about 2008. He is responsible in many ways for what this group in Cambridge do. He's going to be sharing his recommendations on AI governance initiatives, and so on it goes. On the actual subject of the rise and implications of artificial general intelligence, we've heard a lot of comments from Otto today as to what various people think. In 7 days' time, we will have a presentation mainly by Rohit Talwar from Fast Future and myself. We'll have a few guests, that's still being worked out, and we will share our reactions to the 199 sets of answers that were fed into this survey. And I have to say, one of the answers there, when do people think it is likely that AGI will emerge? For what it's worth, more than a third of people thought there's a 50% chance it will emerge by 2030. And 2/3 thought it was likely to emerge by 2040. Personally, I think these probabilities are a bit high, but we can discuss why people came up with these views and the arguments they raised in their survey responses. So that's in 1 week's time. 2 weeks' time, we will have a talk about rejuvenation mechanisms, younging mechanisms, an alternative view. So this is a different viewpoint from what you will often hear when people talk about solutions for anti-aging, and that will be by 2 independent longevity researchers. Looking further ahead, in I think 4 weeks' time, we will have a presentation by Elise Bohan, senior research scholar from the Future of Humanity Institute. She also believes that in some ways this is a make or break century. There are high probabilities of humanity becoming in a very broken state sometime this century, but she also has high views on the possibility of positive outcomes too, in which he calls future superhuman or our transhuman lives. You will find details of all these events and in due course other forthcoming London Futurist events on our website. I'm going to pass the microphone back now to Otto. Otto has given us a very interesting presentation today. Are there any final remarks you'd like to ask the audience to keep in mind, either the ones watching live or the ones watching the replay online?
I think if there's one thing that you should remember, perhaps, so it depends whether you're already existential risk convinced or not. I think if you're not existential risk convinced, then I would say read Toby Ord, become existential risk convinced potentially, or not. And I mean, if you have a really great argument that that this is not something to worry about, please write a paper, detailing it. And some people have actually done that, and I think it really helps the discussion forward as well. And if you are already existential risk convinced, already is kind of assuming it's a one-way street. It's not really true, but if you are, if you do think that this is a big issue, then I would just like to restate the call for communication. If we think that communication to general audience is a good idea, then we should do it as well. And there are so many ways in which this could be done. We've demonstrated one way, and we think that our way is also open to a fair amount of people. So I would hope that other people start doing similar things. But in any case, I think if we have decided that this is a good idea, then there are lots of ways in which we could inform a general audience, and I would suggest that we start doing this. So if you can in any way help, then please do so. Yeah, and of course, I would just like to thank David very much for inviting me. As I said before, it's really nice to be presenting here on the stage where I was convinced as well by Anders Sandberg. My own awareness was raised here, and I remember well that I walked out and my head was just exploding with his 50 slides with calculations and interesting ideas at almost all the slides. So I don't think I was able to reach quite that level, but it's really nice to be present at the same stage. And I want to just thank you for making these discussions possible. I think most of the people presenting here have a really nice, interesting idea, and I'm happy to be part of that.
Well, you are an inspiring example, Otto. You had your career sorted out. You were working on issues that were clearly important, but you gained the perception that there were more important topics. And so in some sense, you've moved out of a relatively well-structured, safe career option and embraced something with a lot of risk because you have believed this is what the world needs. And so that can inspire others too. So I'm sure in a few years' time, there will be people coming to London Futurists and say, my life was changed by what I heard and saw Otto doing in that presentation a few years ago. So thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to pause the recording in a moment, and I will be back in about 7 or 8 minutes, and we will continue, those of us who are still here, in an informal setting in which everybody will have a chance to, if they wish, turn on their microphone, turn on their cameras, and discuss the topics that have not yet been adequately explored. Thank you so much.